She came back to awareness with mud packed against her cheek and a weight across her ribs that made every breath feel borrowed. Something hard pressed her shoulder. Somewhere close, a child cried and then went quiet. She tried to turn her head and couldn't. The darkness was complete, the kind that erased distance and time. She opened her mouth to shout and swallowed grit instead. The slope above Medellin had let go in the middle of the day. In the hillside neighborhood of Villatina, homes sat stacked along the incline, built where the ground looked steady until it didn't. After days of rain, the earth finally split. On September 27, 1987, around 2:40 in the afternoon, roughly 20,000 cubic meters of soil and rock slid off the southeastern side of Cerro Pan de Azúcar and surged down into the upper part of the barrio. In a strip of ground barely more than a hectare wide, the slide tore through the neighborhood and crushed dozens of houses, leaving hundreds dead and many more with nothing. She had been inside her family's house when the wall shook. There was no warning siren, no time to run downhill. One moment she was standing in a cramped room, and the next she was on the floor with the ceiling coming apart above her. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a deep, grinding roar, like the earth tearing itself open. The floor pitched. A rush of mud and broken board slammed through the structure and folded it inward. She felt herself roll, caught between fragments of brick and wood, then everything tightened around her and stopped. When she could breathe again, it was in shallow pulls. Her throat burned. Her hands searched blindly until her fingertips found a gap, barely wide enough to slip through. The space around her was small, a pocket formed by collapsed beams. It was quiet enough that she could hear muffled voices above, distant and frantic, and the intermittent crack of wood settling. She tried to answer them. The first sound that came out was a rasp. Outside, people sprinted toward the scar on the hillside, slipping in fresh mud. Mothers screamed names into the rubble until their voices broke. Men dug with hands, boards, anything that could scrape away the sludge. Within hours, rescuers and civil defense crews were trying to cut through walls of debris that in places rose higher than a person. By late that night and into the next day, workers dug through as much as 20 feet of mud and wreckage, growing more exhausted as signs of life became rarer. In her pocket of space, time stopped behaving like time. She counted breaths because counting was the only thing that made minutes real. When she inhaled, pain flared along her side, and she didn't know if something inside was cracked or simply bruised. She tried to move her legs and felt sharp resistance, as if her hips were pinned by something heavy. She couldn't tell what was trapped and what was numb from pressure. The air smelled of wet earth, splintered wood, and something metallic that could have been blood or rust or just fear turning her stomach. She tried to stay still, because every movement made the rubble creak. The darkness stayed absolute. When she closed her eyes, nothing changed. When she opened them, nothing changed. She imagined the outside world and pictured a doorway, a street, a neighbor's face, just to keep her mind from shrinking into the hole with her. Once, she heard a small voice nearby calling for someone, then coughing, then fading away. She pressed her forehead against the mud and forced herself not to panic, because panic would steal air she didn't have. At some point, a new sound reached her, closer now, digging. Not a single shovel strike, but the steady scrape of hands and tools and voices shouting names. She tried to scream again. Her throat produced a thin sound that barely carried. She struck the wood above her with the heel of her palm. The effort sent a wave of nausea through her and left her shaking. She hit again, slower this time, listening for any answer. A hand finally broke into her space, fingers groping, then gripping her wrist. Someone spoke so fast she couldn't catch the words, but the tone was urgent and alive. More light followed, thin at first, then widening as boards were pulled away. The brightness made her eyes water. She saw a face smeared with mud, the rescuer's jaw clenched, his hands trembling from effort. He told her to hold on. He told her they had her. They widened the opening carefully. Bodies and slides weren't just buried. They were twisted, wedged under beams and rocks that could shift with one wrong pull. She felt them slide mud away from her chest. The first full breath she took was so deep it hurt. She tried to sit up and pain spiked low in her body, bright and immediate. She cried out and heard it echo strangely off the debris around her. They didn't yank her out. They worked inch by inch, bracing boards, clearing fragments, lifting just enough to keep the pocket from collapsing. Around them, the digging never stopped. Every few minutes, someone shouted that they'd found a body, or they'd found a voice, or they'd found nothing at all. When they finally pulled her free, she lay on her back on the ruined hillside, gasping, coated in brown silt, her hair stiff with grit. She looked toward where her house had been and saw only a torn slope, broken timbers and household objects half buried as if the neighborhood had been poured into the ground. She tried to speak a name and couldn't force the words through. Medics moved her away from the slide zone as the ground continued to ooze and settle. Around her, families searched the mud with hands wrapped in cloth, some of them bleeding, some of them praying, some of them silent. Radios crackled with updates that kept changing as the scale of the disaster became clear. Over the next day, the chances of finding anyone alive collapsed. The work turned from rescue to recovery, and the hillside became a place where people listened for signs and then dug anyway, because not digging felt worse. Later counts placed the dead in the hundreds, with Villatina remembered as one of Medellin's worst landslide disasters. For survivors, the number mattered less than the faces. The girl who had lived 3 houses down, the old man who sold bread in the morning, the family that had arrived from the countryside and built a home where land was cheap because land was dangerous. She survived because her body had landed in a pocket that didn't collapse, because a beam held long enough, because someone heard the tapping and refused to stop digging. That fact followed her afterward in a way she couldn't explain. She remembered the darkness most of all, the pressure across her chest, the grit in her teeth, the way time had turned into a series of breaths she wasn't sure she could afford. She had gone into the ground in the middle of a normal day and come out knowing how quickly the earth could close over people and keep going as if nothing had happened. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.